this is all about this current Supreme Court case, Louisiana versus, is it Calais?
Oh,
Calais?
if we tried to pronounce it,
Whatever.
there'd be somebody from Louisiana that would come back.
So this started off as a lawsuit over Louisiana's congressional map, and now it's a major issue before the Supreme Court because it has to do with respect to things like minority majority districts. Now, to give you, well, do you want to let's go into just a little bit of background with respect to the Voting Rights Act. So the Voting Rights Act is partially in response to the kind of the larger civil rights movement that was taking place, and it was this idea of making sure that everybody in the United States was not being deliberately discriminated against by everything from the government to establishments, the economy, et cetera. Because you had significant issues within southern states under Jim Crow laws, which was deliberately gerrymandering in such a way as to minimize the impact of minority voters, specifically black voters within the United States. And so when you had adjustments to the Civil Rights Act, to the Voting Rights Act, the idea is that you were going to have requirements for majority minority districts. But now we're into this weird case where you can literally draw a map to give majority minority districts, but if you draw it in certain ways, it's still considered racist. And so there's been all kinds of Supreme Court battles, court cases about what constitutes a fair and accurate and interpretation of the Voting Rights Act when it comes to drawing some of these districts. Because you can literally have someone claiming that you dissipated the minority vote too much, and so your districts are unconstitutional, or not unconstitutional, but in violation of the Voting Rights Act. You can also draw them in such a way where you theoretically put too many minority voters in one district, and now you disenfranchise them a different way because even though you have a majority minority district, you have too many minorities, which means you could have other minorities in other congressional districts. Essentially, what it's come to be is this. It seems to be all up into judicial interpretation for whoever's looking at that particular time. And it constantly ends up being a source of discussion and argumentation and legal challenges. And now we have a court case where theoretically the Supreme Court could say, yeah, this just wasn't set up well. And theoretically they could say, this is not constitutional based off of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So that's framing all of it up. That's kind of what we're looking at right now. Christian, what do you want to add to that?
Yeah, let me add some brief context to the court case. And I'm actually going to bring up the Wikipedia article for it,
So I gave you kind of an overview of some of the issues with the interpretation of the Voting Rights Act. Christian's going to give you some insight into this specific case and why it's been elevated to potentially challenge everything that I just discussed.
Yeah. So I've got this article up here, not because I trust Wikipedia, but actually because it has a left-wing bias. And
Yeah.
I'll explain what I mean in a second, because we've also got a piece from the New York Times that we're going to go through.
Yeah.
And they're melting down over this, to put it lightly. So the background of this case is pretty simple. Louisiana was given 6 seats in the 2020 census. The Republican majority in the legislature drew a 5-1 map, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 1 Democrat. The Democrat is in New Orleans. And so it was pretty much unchanged from the previous census. Well, the typical stuff happened, right? You had Democrats using the Voting Rights Act as a means to do this, suing the state and basically saying, you created a racial gerrymander that, the argument was right here that because the state is 30% black, that there needed to be 2 black majority districts, aka 2 Democrat majority districts. You have to understand, for better or for worse, in the South, race equals partisanship.
Mm-hmm.
In a state like Louisiana, Republicans will win easily 80+% of the white vote, and Democrats will win 90+% of the black vote in a state like Louisiana. So this is a ploy to really make a political argument, but pretend that it's not a political argument and say that it's a racial argument.
Mm-hmm.
And so they made the argument that there needed to be a second majority minority district in Louisiana. It went through the court system, and you had a similar case that was going on in Alabama at the time, and this was kind of tied into it. The Supreme Court ruled on the VRA, not on constitutional grounds. They ruled using the VRA as a metric, Voting Rights Act, to determine if this was the case. And the court did rule in the Allen decision that it was. And so what that meant was that Louisiana had to draw a second minority majority district. aka a second Democrat district.
Mhm.
And so what Louisiana did is that they ended up drawing what is now currently the 6th congressional district, which is this hideous monstrosity that goes from Shreveport all the way to Baton Rouge. This was like their only way that they could do this.
Yeah.
That is insane.
So this is what I was trying to articulate before, is that it wasn't as simple as saying you need majority and minority districts. It's the Democrats constantly arguing that you need more of these sorts of districts, even if geographically it makes no sense, right? But the claim is that, well, you're too majority minority in this one district, and so you've disenfranchised minority voters. And it really comes to a point where you start to look at this going, okay, this is impossible unless you think this
Unless
is a
you
good
do something
district.
like that.
Unless you think this is a good district.
That's the problem. So they drew this map because Louisiana was basically forced to do so, and they also had to draw it in a way where they would protect one of their members on the Appropriations Committee in Congress and the Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Mhm.
Louisiana actually has two of the most powerful members of Congress in the House, and they intentionally drew the map in a way to protect them from losing. And
Yeah.
they even said this in the Supreme Court case because they're allowed to do that. And they said, like, look, this is beneficial to our state. We're not going to eliminate the speaker's district.
Yeah.
Like, we want the speaker to be from our state. So yeah, they had to draw it this way. Well, that was interesting because then you had a group of quote unquote non-African American voters,
Mhm.
mostly white, but also some Hispanic voters, that sued in response and said, well, now we're being discriminated against because you intentionally drew a map to benefit one demographic group that cut across the entire state. And in doing so, you've now disenfranchised us from doing that. So that's a constitutional challenge, not a statutory challenge. The Supreme Court was previously ruling on, did these lines violate this law that Congress passed, the VRA? That's a totally different court case than asking whether or not the VRA itself is constitutional.
Mhm.
And so because it immediately became a constitutional challenge, this went straight into the federal court system. And eventually it found its way to the Supreme Court. So you might have a scenario where the Supreme Court a few years ago was ruling to expand the number of VRA districts under the VRA, and then a few years later will actually then rule the VRA unconstitutional because they were just entirely different cases. And so what began as just really a partisan ploy by Democrats to carve out a second Democrat district in Louisiana has now spiraled into a court case to determine the constitutionality of
The VRA
effectively
itself.
the entirety of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act.
Real quick, RA had a question there. He says, am I correct in my understanding that census only counts bodies, not actual U.S. citizens? That is correct. And you want the census to count everybody. The problem is that when you apportion congressional representation based off of the census without differentiating between U.S. citizens and non-citizens, you actually get more districts with non-citizens. Or you get congressional districts which disproportionately represent non-citizens, but still have the same power as a district that maybe represents all U.S. citizens or majority U.S. citizens. So that ends up being a real problem with respect to apportionment in Congress. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just want to answer that question.
So here's some more context. I've got the New York Times article pulled up here, and there's a reason we're going to be reading from the New York Times because they are not happy at what's going on.
They're a little bit upset.
It was literally yesterday that the court was having oral arguments on this case. And there were some strong signs that the conservatives on the court are about to use this particular case to upend Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. If that were to happen, it would easily be the most consequential political decision that the court has issued in probably 100 years. It would completely, permanently change the function of congressional elections, the makeup of the House of Representatives. It would arguably, not even arguably, it would almost certainly result in the complete elimination of every Democrat seat in the South, with the exception of maybe 3 in the Atlanta metro area, just because there's probably no way that Republicans in Georgia can eliminate them just because of sheer numbers.
Mm-hmm.
But if Section 2 were to be repealed or ruled unconstitutional, or even part of Section 2 ruled unconstitutional, it would completely change our politics. And let me explain how. So the New York Times article goes on to say, it's talking about the case, right? It says Republicans may not eliminate every Democrat leaning district that they technically could, more on why later, but the party's aggressive mid cycle redistricting suggests that it would eliminate enough to obtain a structural advantage going into the midterms and especially going into the 2028 election. Now, here's where things get interesting. And it's here that you realize that this is not just about Louisiana, this is about the entire country. So, for the first time in arguably ever, multiple states are redrawing their congressional maps in the middle of the decade. The way that this normally works is you do a census every 10 years. That census appropriates congressional seats to each state based on that state's population. Then that state draws congressional maps if they're allocated more than one seat. And then they do it all over again 10 years later. Well, multiple states are now redrawing their maps in the middle of the decade in order to give the party that controls that state a better chance of winning the House of Representatives in the 2026 midterm elections. So Texas is redrawn, Missouri has redrawn, California is probably about to redraw. You have a variety of states that are doing this. And this Supreme Court case might end up resulting in a bunch of southern states doing the same thing. And that's the reason that Democrats are kind of freaking out, because the New York Times came up with this metric here and said that, if Texas, Missouri, and Utah end up redrawing, Utah's probably going to have to redraw because Democrats successfully sued. Democrats will need a 1.3 percentage margin of victory nationwide in order to flip the House next year. If California redistricts, it's basically an even fight. If Democrats win a majority of the popular vote in the next year's elections, they will win the House. Now, if Florida, Indiana, Ohio, and Kansas also redraw, then it needs to be a D plus 2.5 environment for them to flip the House. Now, if Section 2 is struck down and the southern states redraw to eliminate their Democrat-held, effectively what I like to call their DEI districts, which is exactly what they are, then you would need a blue wave in order for them to barely flip the House of Representatives. You would need a 2018-style blue wave for them to get 218 seats, which is a one-seat majority. And so, naturally, this is creating almost like a doomsday scenario for Democrats. Like, this is something that they never thought was even possible. And it not only seems possible, it seems likely that this is going to happen.